Classical criticism. Classical criticism is divided into number of lessons. When we talk about the word classical, we need to understand that classical means of the first order, of the first rate, in the sense that it cannot be tampered with. And when we are talking about classical criticism, the issues raised by the classical thinkers, they are still relevant. There is no alternative to classical thought and classical ideas, and the same is applied to classical criticism, and it has been divided into a number of lessons. In the first lecture, we will discuss about what is classical criticism. This is introductory in nature. When we look at the present criticism and the old school of criticism, so there is a huge difference between the two. When we talk about the old school, they want much facilities like the way we have in the present day world. It's a digitized world, it's a digitized universe, we would say, and we have every facility at our disposal, but the ancients did not enjoy those things. The kind of infrastructure, the kind of facilities, the kind of technological marvels that are there at our disposal, they were not there during the time of the ancients. We have the facilities of digitization, so if a play needs to be revisited, we can easily access it. We can move from one point to the other point, but in the old school, these facilities were not available at all. Now, when revisiting a performance became difficult, so it gave rise to special aesthetics. Now, when we talk about special aesthetics, it is applicable in both the domains, in acting, on the part of the poet as well, and then when we talk about aesthetics in the domain of criticism, so it gave rise to those special aesthetics. It was to be seen and felt everywhere, because as we understood that revisiting a performance, unlike the present day, wasn't possible. Then there was immediacy of communication. All forms of art, they communicate. Paintings, they communicate to us. Drama, epic, poetry, everything communicates. It communicates certain ideas, certain feelings, certain emotions. So communication was really important, because as I said, revisit to a performance was nearly impossible. So communication had to be really effective in order to capture the attention of the audience, the spectators, or the critics. Then there was the element of questionable innovation. Innovation was questionable because the artist, in this case the poet, he had to be an adherent to the old order. There were certain established rules, and the poet had to function within the framework of those rules. So any sort of innovation was not desirable. So artist was an adherent to the old order. Then we have the role of poetic muses. You must be acquainted with Milton's Paradise Lost. You also must be acquainted with Pope's The Rape of the Lock. We find that the poets, they seek inspiration from the muses. Poetic muses were the goddess of poetry. So the poet was working through an inspiration which he received from the poetic muses. So there wasn't much scope for poet to move from the fixity of rules. Then when we talk about the world was created by the gods. It was in perfect order. God being supreme when we talk about the hierarchy, God was at the top, and the earth was supposed to be a copy of the heavens. Here you may try to understand it in a better way through the chain of being on which Elizabethans laid focus, and that is that at the top we have God, below God we have angels, then human beings, then animals, then vegetation, and then finally we have stones. So it was a chain of being, and in that chain of being we notice that even the artist has been assigned a place by these classical thinkers. So artist, when we talk about the artist too was an imitator. He was imitating things, an incident that might have taken place in the past. Well, different philosophers like Plato has a different take on this, and Aristotle talks about this imitation in a different way. We'll understand these differences later on when we talk about these philosophers, these critics at later stages. So it was based upon imitation, like the earth is a copy of the heavens. So similarly, art was also a copy. Then there was need for the poet to produce something meaningful, meaning thereby that he had to be authentic. He had to capture the attention of the audience or the spectators. So he had to produce something really meaningful which was acceptable in the social order. When we talk about Plato's objections, but Plato came out with certain objections to art. He denied space to the artist in his Republic. Republic is a text that talks about an ideal state, and it's a work that is read across disciplines, and its study is really important from the point of view of art. So there was vacuum for innovation. Innovation wasn't allowed. Why innovation was not allowed? Because according to Plato, with the role of muses, the poet delivered everything when he was inspired. And when one is inspired, according to Plato, one is in a state of madness. And when one is mad, one cannot produce anything meaningful. So that's why, because there was no scope, there was vacuum for innovation, and then there were the fixity of rules. Rules were fixed. The poet could not deviate from the rules laid down by ancients, and there was complete denial of the idea art for art's sake. We know that art is independent. It's even independent of the human will because it replicates nature. Then the poet, according to Plato, handled the themes of unreality and untruth. Now, how unreality? The poet might be talking about an incident. He might be reenacting something which has not taken place at all. It might simply be the imagination of his mind, and that's not real. Again, when we look at the theater, we find that unreality exists. Why? Because in real life we are taught to bear our misfortunes bravely and courageously. But because of the generation of association of feelings by the poet, the audience or the spectators, they associate themselves with the character on the stage, with the actor on the stage. And then many a people, those who are soft-hearted or impressionistic, we've noticed that during theatrical performances, many of them have tears in their eyes. So it moves them. Whereas the reality is that whatsoever misfortune we might have faced in life, we don't cry. We need to courageously bear our misfortunes, and that's where Plato had strong objections to art, that it depicts unreality, it talks about untruth. However, it is important that when Plato talks about unreality and this imitation, he condemns it, but during this condemnation, a very important element comes on the surface, and that is the emotive element in art. He talks about emotions, because when artist through his art tries to move the audience, so we notice that yes, artist has something that he is able to capture the attention, and he is able to arouse those emotive feelings in the audience or the spectators. So we cannot deny the emotive element, and this is one of the major contribution of Plato as far as art is concerned. Now, when we talk about classical thinkers, Greek civilization is the parent civilization for the entire Christendom. When we are talking about the Christian world, so it's the Greeks who are considered to have laid the foundations of all modern institutions. You might have heard the name of Hippocrates, you might have come across Euclid's geometry, you might have come across Pythagoras' theorems on mathematical applications. So we find that Greeks are everywhere. Greek philosophy is across all disciplines. So when we are talking about philosophy, so the major thinkers are Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. They mainly existed from 8th century BC to 4th century BC. In the domain of literature, we have Homer. You might have read his Odyssey, Iliad. You have Euripides, Aristophanes and Sophocles. Sophocles is famous for his trilogy of Oedipus, the king, Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone. Now, the classical thinkers laid focus on regularity of form, diction, simplicity, balance and a sense of beauty. They expected a sense of beauty from the text, from the performance. We will discuss in detail about this sense of beauty. Then another notable point about is that literary theory existed prior to literary criticism. Theory was already there because there was fixity of rules and the writers had to work within those fixity of rules. So, literary theory existed prior to criticism. In the Roman world, the major classical thinkers were Longinus and Horace. We find that Longinus imitates and so does Horace. So, they are greatly influenced by these classical thinkers. Now, let us have a look at the impact of classical thinkers. Imitation by Roman dramatists like Seneca. When we talk about Senecan tragedies, we find that he is greatly influenced by these classical thinkers. Virgil was greatly influenced by Homer, and the classical influence was felt the strongest in France and England in 17th and 18th centuries. It was also noticed and felt in the writings of the Germans such as those of Goethe and Schiller. In 20th century, it can be noticed in the writings of Sartre. It may be noted that the Greeks laid emphasis on rhetoric and philosophy. We need to understand philosophy varies, the various domains of philosophy, and rhetoric was really important. If philosophy was which had to be conducive to the society, it had to be accepted by the society of those times. The most notable area when we are talking about this period is the emergence of rhetoric, the spirit of inquiry for knowing the truth, spirit of questioning. So, poiesis is another field which was really important and it was their favorite. Poiesis is to bring something into being which never existed before, and when we are talking about theatre, so the artist, the dramatist, they were writing something, which might not have existed before. Then Plato comes out with mimesis, that's the theory of imitation. So, mimesis is the term which is applied for imitative purposes. We all imitate. Our child learns through imitation. We know that when a child acquires the skill of language, the first skill is listening, then speaking, and then reading and writing. And how does a child learn? He listens first and then he imitates. We find that the servants imitate their masters, lower classes imitate the upper classes, and there is an important theory also, probably influenced by Plato, you need to know and understand it. When Macaulay during the British times was entrusted with the task of educating the Indians, he came out with an idea, and the idea was that the British government need to educate only the upper classes. The lower classes would follow them, and as a result, the Indians would be educated. So he confined the allocation of the budgetary requirements only to the upper classes. So similarly, and that theory is termed as downward filtration theory. So I think Macaulay was greatly influenced by Plato if we analyze that. So we find that everybody imitates. So imitation, it's through imitation that we learn. Then what the artist is doing is, he is reproducing the speech of a character. Drama is in fact a representation of what is really not present, and hence a reproduction of a past reality of futuristic happenings, recreation of an action, experience, idea or assumption. Audience watching these performances are misled by artists to live through an unrealistic experience. And because he might talk about future, he might talk about past, which may not be a reality. So what Plato is doing is, according to Plato, what the artist is doing is misleading the public. So objection to dramatization, as it led people to live lives other than their own. Only reality for Plato was in ideas. The poet imitated these ideas. A play or an epic therefore becomes a copy of a copy, and hence is thrice removed from reality. You need to understand this in the light of an example which Plato gives. He talks about a chair. He says that the chair is an idea. Idea is the first degree reality in the mind of the carpenter. The carpenter makes a chair, and after it has been made, we look at the chair. So what we perceive is the third degree reality according to Plato. Rhetoric and philosophy, as we talked about, these were the major domains. So some of the famous works of Plato are Republic, Ion, Dialogues of Plato, Phaedrus and Cratylus, etc. Phaedrus talks about the poet being divinely inspired. In book 2, he discusses his place in society. His most significant contribution is his opposition to Poesis, which led his student Aristotle to postulate a crucial work named Poetics. And this is what he talks about, that Aristotle was inspired by his objections, and he refutes Plato's percepts, and therein we find that Aristotle also comes out with meaningful theory in the form of a book named Poetics. Then there are two terms, Digenesis and Mimesis. Mimesis we've already discussed. Now Digenesis is wherein we find the poet filling in the gap of narration. He narrates the incidents, he fills in those gaps, and that's usually in epic, but in plays we don't find the artist or the dramatist coming into the picture, because the characters themselves speak. So this is the major difference. Then Aristotle talks about the world is like a biological organism. Art is like a biological organism. Any piece of art, it has to be like a biological organism. Nature, like nature, art has the potential to unfold itself like in a seed. Plato's objection to poetry, cutting it off from the universal, is addressed by Aristotle, assigning it a higher place. He believed that poetry is more philosophical. It's more philosophical than history. History deals with the particular, but poetry deals with the universal. We talk about, the child born in Africa cries in the same language. All human beings have same emotions and passions across geographical locations. So history is confined to a specific time frame. According to Aristotle, poetry is the highest form. So it is more philosophical. So after a lot of deliberations on the subject, Aristotle considered tragedy to be superior because of the element of Digenesis and Mimesis. So, in epic, the poet had to intervene for narrative purposes, but that's not the case in the drama. So, in stating so, he is largely guided by Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, and he makes distinctions even within the genre of tragedy. However, he believed that both tragedy and the epic should have unity of action, whereby various incidents must be so arranged that if any of them is differently placed or taken away, the effect of wholeness will be seriously disrupted. That's what Aristotle is talking about. He talks about a play or a piece of art developing like nature and then having the shape of a biological organism. So, if any part is taken away, you look at imagine the body of a biological animal, and if you take out anything, any part from a biological being, you would find that incomplete. Same is applied to the domain of art, epic, whether it is epic, drama or poetry. So, another hallmark of Aristotle was his observation of catharsis. Catharsis is the emotive element which Plato has already discussed. So, the tragic hero is described at length in his Poetics. He talks about an ideal hero, that he has to be an average man. Then we notice that during the classical phase, we find that dialogue assumes an importance. So, various critics have talked about dialogue in detail. Then there was oratory and rhetoric, the spirit of questioning, the spirit of inquiry to know the truth, and the art of oratory was really important. We find that oratory is still very important, wherein we find political leaders. I mean, a great political leader has to be a great orator. Then composition of manuals was done, which is termed as technai, by Corax and Tisias. So, they highlighted the difference between forensic speech and other objects. We have Gorgias, and he was an ambassador to Athens. He evolved a system for using rhymes. Then we have Thrasymachus, he composed model speeches for different purposes. Rhetoric now evolved for practical purposes. Then we have Isocrates, who was student of Gorgias and Tisias, and he became famous during 4th century as a rhetorician and speech writer. So, Plato emphasizes Gorgias and Phaedrus. They highlighted the moral value of good and effective speech. So, we know that art of speaking was gaining much importance as it led to molding of minds for better purposes, such as debates in courts, etc., etc. So, Aristotle was focusing on urbanity, clarity, appropriateness and elaboration, and he preferred the use of metaphor. Greek theatrical tradition recommended that an oration should be divided into parts of speech such as introduction, narrative and epilogue. It was applicable to all subjects including legal, forensic or literary. This structure formed the basic pattern of writing essays, and it's still followed in the Western world and in legal and other formal writings across the world. Thank you.